My next guest on the Zapata Brand podcast is usually on this side of the microphone, but today he's on the other side. I get to ask him the questions. My guest is former sports writer for Yahoo Sports, Kevin Iole.
Coming up next on the Zapata Brand podcast, he's an award-winning columnist that covers all combat sports. He has covered every major fight in boxing and UFC. Now, you get to hear his story. The Zapata Brand podcast welcomes Kevin Iole.
Well, Kevin Iole, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I appreciate it, George. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, firstly, usually you're on this side of the mic, but as I was going through some of the research, I've never got to know who Kevin Iole was, and I've been a big fan for years. And I always wanted to know who you were and how you got started in the covering combat sports.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was born and raised in Pittsburgh, and I went to college my first year, University of Miami in Florida. But I transferred back to a small college in Pittsburgh that had a great journalism program, Point Park University. Now it was Point Park College back in those days, and I love boxing. I grew up as a fan of Muhammad Ali and idolized Muhammad Ali, and so I just always loved boxing. And so I got a full-time job when I was 19 years old at a small paper in Pittsburgh. And there was monthly boxing shows at one of the hotels, and they were small, level shows, and nobody was covering it. And I said, "Do you guys mind if I cover it?" And they let me cover it, and that was kind of my entree into covering combat sports. I loved combat sports. At the time, was pretty much boxing. There weren't any other shows,
Right.
back then. You didn't have karate shows or of course, MMA didn't even exist for a long time at that point. But there were no other martial arts type shows. It was just boxing. But I got into covering boxing back then, and that was probably in the late 70s when I was still in college. And then I got the paper I was working for. There was a heavyweight title fight, Larry Holmes against Ronaldo Snipes. And I got a chance to cover that fight because I had been covering all those small, shows in a hotel. It was a Howard Johnson's hotel. And all of a sudden now we have a heavyweight title fight in Pittsburgh. And so my boss, being this, I never thought I would go. Like, I was the junior guy on the staff. He said, "Yeah, no, you're covering the fight. Let's go." And so that was my first big fight that I covered. And I've loved it. And it's been something that I've done ever since.
Well, who was the promoters out there in Pittsburgh? Was that the Acres? Were they out there?
Mike Acree was in Erie. These were local promoters. I don't think people would have known in there. And they were doing a show, a monthly show to Howard Johnson. They were really low level shows. It was just, like for kids locally that wanted to fight and didn't have any other place to go. But it was fun. It was something, and I learned how to tell stories, basically doing that, because that's what combat sports is all about when you're a boxing journalist, telling the story of the fighter.
Which again, we can jump around a little bit, but one of the things where HBO was so good at was telling the story in those little vignettes before the fight. It got you invested into the product itself. I think they're lacking that now.
I think, yeah. Well, I think what you have to care about. Why am I watching this fight? What is it about this fight that makes me care about it? Right? That's George. I think that's how I always try to approach any fight story that I'm writing, is like, why would I care about this fight? And, there's always a reason why you should care. But a lot of times people don't care because boxing, there's no barrier to entry. So, and combat sports as well. MMA is the same way, but, MMA has kind of gone off on a different path. But I'm speaking specifically about boxing now. You have to, tell people, why should you watch this fight and what is the story of the fighters in. And if you feel a connection with one of the fighters, whether a positive connection or a negative connection, right, then you're more apt. A lot of people watch Floyd Mayweather when he became such a big star. 50% of the people watched because they wanted to see him win. 50% of the people watched because they wanted to see him lose. But everybody wanted to see him, and he became a huge star. And I think, the promoters don't always do a good job, and the fighters haven't always done a good job of making themselves available. The ones who do are the ones that tend to become stars. And, it doesn't, people think that stars mean, You just have talent. And that's in a team sport, that's a large part of what it is. But in an individual sport like boxing, where you're selling tickets based on personality, I want to see this guy fight. Who cared if Arturo Gatti won or lost? You might have been a diehard Gatti fan and you really wanted him to win. But at the end of the day, you were watching a Gatti fight because you knew it was blood and guts and it was just going to be an unbelievable battle in the ring. And if he won or if he lost, it was still going to be the same kind of fight. That you have to create some kind of identity why people care about you. And I think the fighters and the managers and the promoters that do that for the boxers, they're going to be the ones that are successful.
And why do you think fighters tend to lean away from that? Is it because of, they're kind of exposed out there, fighting, they lose, they talk a lot of stuff, but I don't know why they've gone away from that.
Well, I think, there's a lot, the media has changed a lot, like in the time, since I started doing this, right? When I started it, every major city newspaper had a boxing writer, like every single one of them. And you would go to a major championship bout and there would be, 2 papers from Boston, 2 papers from Chicago, 4 or 5 papers from New York, papers from Los Angeles, Las Vegas, everywhere, Texas, all the big cities in Texas. But they were all trained journalists who had done this for a long time. And now, the way the internet and the way the sport has gone and everything and things have changed, it's opened up the door for everybody out there. And there's a lot of people like yourself, right? Your main job is not as a boxing journalist, but you want to be in the boxing space, interviewing fighters and talking about fights. And so there's so many more people, and it's hard for the fighters sometimes to know who is who. And I don't think they a lot of times get good advice. Now, there's a lot of really good PR people out there that do a really good job of Swanson Communications, Sternberg Communications, Brenner's Weichel Associates. Some of these firms, they do a really good job of helping promote the fighters that they work with. And those tend to have successful fighters. But, I think that it's so difficult because there are so many people that are quote unquote journalists nowadays.
And again, I don't take offense to this at all, but can I ask you, does it bother you when someone who gets into your space and kind of feels that they deserve more, that I'm going to just report the way I want to report, and that's what, or is there, because there are certain rules, unwritten rules in in journalism, but does that bother you at all?
No, I mean, here's the thing. The only issue that I have that I would say is if somebody comes into our space where we're professionally working and they're not professional. If you are professional, then God bless you. And I hope you and I have helped countless people, to try to make it in this business, right? I think the most prominent, Ariel Helwani of MMA fighting. Ariel wasn't getting credentialed to the UFC, called me. I called Dana White. I helped get him credentialed. And then after he ran afoul of Dana White and Lorenzo Fertitta and got banned, I made phone calls to get him back in, because I kind of felt like that is what you do. And so Ariel is a journalism graduate, and he was going to make it whether I helped him or not. I just happened to be the vehicle at the particular time. But I have a lot of kids that are, wanting to get into the space, and they all email me privately, and I'll critique their writing. I'll give them advice and everything. So I don't have a problem with that. The only problem I have is when they don't realize, hey, I'm working for a living and I'm trying to do my job professionally the best I can. And if you're there having fun and just goofing off and, using quote journalism as a way to get a free ticket to the fights, if that's the case, then I have a problem with you. But if you're there and you really, even if it's not your full-time job, you're doing it as hey, I admire that. And we need good journalists. And you don't need to have a journalism degree to be a good, journalist in any, field, but especially in combat sports. And so as long as the people are professional and they carry themselves a certain way, I say, hey, great, come on. I love to see it.
And yeah, that's important to me because initially reaching out, I said, "Oh, geez, I'm going top of the food chain here." That's was a reach for me, and I appreciated your time there because I would love the feedback too. I do it here at my business, the same thing. I tell my employees, "Hey, this is what I expect," and if they follow it, most of them do, but there are some that don't.
Right.
So yeah, I'd appreciate that. So as you get into your first fight, it was Snipes Holmes. That was your first big fight coverage.
Right.
Now, was when you first did that, were you in shock, or was it kind of like, what was the feeling going into that, to the arena?
Well, I was excited. You know, it was the heavyweight champion of the world. Larry Holmes was the champion at that point. I think it was either 81 or 82. I can't remember what year it was, but it was in the early 80s. And maybe even 1980, but it was somewhere in the beginning of the 1980s. And Holmes had already, you know, he had beaten Ken Norton to win the title in one of the best fights ever, and with I think the best 15th round ever. If anybody has not seen the 15th round of Holmes Norton, go on YouTube and watch that, because that fight was 7 rounds to 7, and then they go in the 15th round, and they basically stood in the middle of the ring and they slugged it out. And it was like the 15th round was so close. 2 judges gave it to Holmes, 1 judge gave it to Norton, and Holmes won by a very close decision in that fight. But, you know, so Holmes had built up a reputation. He had defended the title a few times and had been getting himself, excuse me, had been getting himself where, you know, he was a successor to Ali, and people were starting to say, hey, you know, this guy is great on his own. You know, it's hard coming in the shadow of Muhammad Ali, and he cast such a huge shadow. It's for people who weren't there in those days, it's hard to understand how big Ali was, but Ali was transcended sports. I mean, he was bigger than anything there was. And so after he was gone, you know, it was difficult for a guy like Larry Holmes, who in my mind is one of the top 3 or 5 heavyweights who ever lived, to you know, get their recognition, you know, coming after Ali. But so it was great for me to cover that event, because, you know, it's a big fight, a heavyweight title fight. You know, Snipes wasn't the biggest name ever, but certainly the fact that I'm getting to cover a title fight in my hometown, that was really crazy.
So when does it become, and you know the professional wrestling terms too, initially like a mark? When are you not like a mark? Because, you know, getting to see a heavyweight title fight front row with credentials on, were you engaged in the fight itself, or knowing I still have a job to do here?
No, of course, I always knew I had a job, right? You know, I wanted
Mhm.
to be a journalist for as long as I can remember. When I was a kid, you know, I used to lay in bed at night, and sometimes if the Pirates were on the West Coast, I would listen to the baseball games on the radio as I went to sleep, and so I would sometimes announce the game myself, right? You know, and just like talk it out. And I always wanted to be in sports journalism in some way, you know, always, you know, for as long as I can remember. That's what I wanted to do. So once I got a chance to do it, even in college, you know, I tried to be as professional as I could all the time. And I knew that I have a job to do. And so, you know, some people say, hey, you've had a great life. And I have. Like, I am not, you know, I'm a lot closer to the end than the beginning. And I'm not done yet, but I understand, like, it's, you know, mostly gone, and I've loved it. But the one thing that I would say, like, say me compared to you, is that, you know, you watch Corrales Castillo or Hagler Hearns or whatever, and you're going, yeah, and you're, you know, you're jumping up and you're having a good time and you're high-fiving, and I'm sitting there, you know, nowadays I'm typing tweets, right, you know, during the fights and putting those up, and I have to sit there as professional and calm and not, you know,
Mhm.
and try not. There's a couple videos on UFC fights where, like, one where Demetrius Johnson jumped in the air and got an armbar, and I went, "Oh my god!" Like, and you can see me on the camera, because I was like, because I am a fan of the sport, right, and I
Right.
love combat sports. But most of the time, you know, you'll see me stone faced, because that's the way we're supposed to conduct ourselves professionally.
So after you're done with the home Snipes fight, you're there, you go to the back or you go to the press conference, you're good. When you come home, decompressing from that has to be, you know, that has to be a difficult thing to do. Now you got to write an article about it.
Well, I did, you know, see, that's the thing that I don't think people understand. Like, you know, maybe the difference between the the professionals who do this for a living and the people who are just kind of having fun at it, make it a hobby. You know, I'll sit there. So, like, Saturday night, I'm going to be at UFC, but this will be the same thing if I'm talking boxing, whatever. You know, I will sit there and I'll write a story, like, from my time at Yahoo. So I'm no longer with Yahoo, but my time at Yahoo, what I would do is, once the main event ended, I had about 5 minutes, maybe less, to get out about 400 or 500 words on the main event. Like, you know, Mayweather Pacquiao. Okay, I got to get something out. We need a story on the site right away. And so I'm doing that, right away, and I'm going as fast as I can. Then as soon as I'm done with that, I go to the post-fight press conference, listen to what the fighters say, and I write a column on that. Sometimes I'll write 2 columns depending on what's going on. And we're doing that in real time immediately as the fight is over, right? I'm not going home and thinking about it and spending a couple days, no, I am sitting there on deadline writing. And even though I'm on the internet now, and you think, well, I don't have a deadline because I'm on the internet. Yeah, the printing presses aren't starting at a certain time, which is what newspaper reporters face, right? When they're writing actually for the newspaper, they have a time that they got to get it in. But, people who are writing on the internet, you have a deadline too, because people are going to go, they want to see who won the fight, and they're going to come, they know, hey, 10:30, the fight should be over. Who won the fight? And we want to have a story up to say, hey, this is who won the fight. This is how it went. So my first story, a lot of times, like let's say when I was in my 17 years at Yahoo, was probably the worst thing I did that night, because I wrote that in 3 or 4 minutes immediately when the fight ended. I didn't have, some guys do, they call running, and they write it as the fight's going, and they, each round they're writing another paragraph and they put it on top. I didn't do that. I wrote it at the end because I wanted it to be an analytic piece as well, a little bit, right, as well as a news piece. And so I did it when it was over. And so I had 3 or 4 minutes to do it. So that first story you would see from me, came in like 3 or 4 minutes. And then afterwards, my second story, that would be a column that came after the press conference.
That is incredibly hard. I can tell you that now, because even when I interview people and we're done, I'm like, oh, I should have asked that. That is incredibly hard. People don't realize how hard that is. That's got to be.
It's like, I'm not complaining, right? I love it. It's the career I chose. It's what I want to do. But I think sometimes, I get a lot, like, everybody does. Like, social media is a cesspool sometimes. It's great for some ways, and it's bad in other ways, right? And so people, they don't know what you're doing, and they, as an example, like I took a picture at the last UFC show I was at, and sometimes we get criticized. Oh, how could you tweet that this happened? Well, sometimes there's 3 cameramen was straight in front of me, and I took a picture of the cameramen. They were like 5 feet in front of me, and they were blocking. They were on the floor, standing up. I'm sitting down. So basically, what could I see but their butts, right? So I took a picture, and there's their back and their butts. Now, you might see me at a UFC show doing this. Well, I'm not looking away from the fight. What I'm doing is there's somebody in front of me, and so I'm looking at this video screen up here I can see it. But then somebody will take and it's happened to me many times, take a screenshot. Oh, Kevin Iole not even paying attention to the fight. No, I am paying attention. That's why I'm looking up at the camera up there. And so it's just like, those people don't know, and it shouldn't bother you, but it does sometimes, right? You're going, like,
No, it does.
What the hell, right?
Yeah, it's incredible. It's incredible. The small amount of time I've been doing this, just yesterday was my first real big one that kind of caught traction. It was based on the Santos Clarissa Shields nonsense that happened there. Her accusations against Derek and what have you. So that one kind of took off on me. And these people are coming at me with comments, and I just repeated what everybody said. I've been in it long enough to know that Derek wouldn't do that. So, so after you get that, you decompress, you write your first article out there, you put it out there. What did you expect when you first put it out there? When your first article comes out, that's covering a big fight. Are you trying to make it too perfect? Are you, really making it try to get as good as possible?
Well, I want, obviously I want to write the best thing I can possibly write, in the circumstance that I have. Now, the advantage you have nowadays writing for the internet is you can go back in and correct it and keep updating it. Typo here, a mistake there, whatever, right? But in the old newspaper days, you were screwed. Like you had a certain time you had to get it in, and then that was it. And so like I'll remember like the Tyson Holyfield, the bite fight, right? So I was working for the Las Vegas Review-Journal newspaper at the time. And I was doing something that now I do all the time, but it was just the Review-Journal had just gone online on the internet, maybe a year or so before that. And I was typing round by round, like play by play, as it happened live, and it wasn't going in and getting edited in any way. What I was now I do it all the time on Twitter, right? But at that time, that was a new thing, and it's going directly live out on the internet, right? So so people were seeing what's going on. So now when Tyson bit Holyfield the first time, I see them come together. I'm in the first row. I was on that fight. I was on the end. Now I'm fortunate enough. Most of the fights I'm sitting in the middle, but on that fight I was in row 1 on the end. And I think I was next to last, and next to me was the great Jim Murray, who, in my opinion, was the greatest sports columnist of all time. He's passed now, but Jim Murray from the LA Times, he was sitting to my left on the aisle, and I was one in. So the fight happens, and Holyfield gets bitten. But I see them come together, and they're kind of like they're in a clinch or whatever. Then you see Holyfield jumping up and down. It's not immediately clear. Now you're at home and you have the announcers, and they are closer. They also have cameras all over, and they have people in the truck talking to them in the ear, telling them what happened. They may not have seen it either, but they have some camera that saw what happened. I don't have that, right? I have no TV in front of me. I have no audio. I'm just watching it. And I see Holyfield stomping up and down. So I don't know what happened. I thought he might have gotten hit low. So I said, Holyfield jumping up and down, not sure what went on. And if, people are like, what, like, what are you talking about? You don't know what happened. But then, all of a sudden it starts circulating around. Hey, he bit him. People are watching the replay in the arena, and you see that he bit him. And so that was kind of an interesting thing. But what happened after that fight? We had 8 reporters at the fight that night at the newspaper. One of them stayed in the press room and just did a story and never moved around. 5 of the other ones left, and me and another guy, we went throughout the casino and we started doing reporting because all hell broke loose that night, right? So we realized this is more than just a boxing match. This is a big news story. There were reports of gunshots in the casino. And I remember we walked up in the casino and I saw players, not players, people, NBA players. They turned out to be turning over blackjack tables, right? I saw them do it. There was all kind of craziness going.
For what reason? Turning over blackjack tables?
Yeah, it was just like,
was it mass chaos?
Yeah, it was just like chaos, right? There was all kind of nuttiness. There was dealers on the floor like this, right? And they were just flipping over the tables. And the MGM, I'm not going to say who the 2 guys are because now it's long afterwards, but both very recognizable. One of them still on TV a lot. Both Hall of Famers. MGM sued them, so you might for chips, right? You might be able to search it and figure it out. But it was nuts. Like there was all sorts of stuff going on. So we're running all through the casino trying to get as much news as we could get to then be able to put into this, because the newspaper back in those days, newspaper have more than one editions, right? The first edition of the press would start, especially on a Saturday night for a Sunday paper earlier. And then you could make updates as the night went along. And so up until about 2 a.m. And so we were trying to get as much in as possible. Like I remember at one point, and this bank of phones isn't there anymore because the front of the casino was has been remodeled since, but I was on the phone and I'm calling the desk, because that was early days of cell phones, and cell phones didn't work inside places really well in those days. Right. And so I did have a cell phone at that time. I had one of those big giant shoe phones, but it didn't work. And so I'm on the phone and I'm calling this, what they call the city desk at the newspaper. That was the news section of the paper. And I'm giving updates on what I'm seeing and what's going on. And I'm standing there and I look next to me and there was a dude and he's got a gun. He's wearing a vest, but not a shirt, and a million chains. And he's got a gun sticking out of his waist. And I'm sitting here talking about all these crime going on in the casino. And I look and I see this guy next to me, and I don't know if he's involved or not, but I don't want to be standing next to a dude with a gun when all this stuff is going. And it's probably 10 to 2 and the paper's done at 2 o'clock. And the city editor, she's no longer with us. I said, Annette, I'm going to call you back. I'm going to go to a different payphone. She's like, no. And I hang up and I go to another phone and I call her and I said, I didn't want to be talking next to this guy, that was there. But it was crazy. At the end of the night, then we come downstairs and go back to the Grand Garden. And who do we see but Kirk Kerkorian, who was the owner of the MGM. And at that point, Kirk Kerkorian was one of the, I don't want to say exactly, but I'm going to say 10 richest guys in the world.
Yeah.
and he wasn't a guy that did interviews or anything, right? And he's coming down, and I see him, and I look at my partner who I was working with, right? And we both say, yeah, we got to talk to him. So at least for a follow-up, we know we're going to be the only people that talk to Kirk Kerkorian.
Right.
So he's standing there, and it was just the three of us. So we walk over and I said, Mr. Kerkorian, Kevin Iole. And I stick out my hand and he shakes my hand, and my partner's about to introduce himself. And we were standing right by a bathroom. All of a sudden, the bathroom door opens and this guy comes out who was the president of the hotel. And he was escorting Mr. Kerkorian to his car. And he goes, no interviews. And he grabs Kerkorian and he shoves him in the bathroom. And that was how our night ended. But it was crazy. And we ended up doing a lot of stories. So I remember I wrote the lead story for the paper. It was on 1A that night. And I probably had, I don't want to say exactly, my memory says 4 or 5 stories.
Okay.
All of which were written after the fight, in the aftermath of what was going on. So I'm at home and I read my local paper, and I'm proud of myself, right? I don't have a too big ego, but I say, hey, Kevin, you did a pretty good job. And my friend Joe did a pretty good job. The two of us, did pretty good. And I drive over to the convenience store because I wanted to see what the LA Times wrote, because I was sitting next to Jim Murray. Now, you had to realize Jim Murray was in his 70s. He was blind at that point. He never left his seat. And I read his story and I immediately went, oh my God. It was like an unbelievably great column. And this dude, never left his seat, was blind, didn't actually see what happened, and ends up writing a column that was sensational, And that night was like one of the crazy nights of my life.
So on that point where you just talked about Jim Murray writing that story, when you write stories, do you know in your own self, like, okay, this is a great story? Do you ever feel down if you feel that you haven't done the greatest story?
Of course.
Okay.
I often do. Like, even when sometimes I'll write a story that's mostly good, I'll read it later. Like, and so when I said before, I can go back in and I can fix things, we make changes or corrections, but we don't rewrite the story later, because that's unethical, right? So I don't change the story totally. Like, if I'm going to change the story totally, I'd have a new URL on it, right? So we'll fix typos, or if there's a factual error I found out, maybe I had the wrong last name of somebody or whatever, I'll fix it, right? But we don't change it. But yeah, of course, like even on a column that I feel like, hey, it was a good column, I said, I wish I had done this. I wish I had done that. I wish I had written it this way. Of course, but it's all part of, you want to do perfection, right?
Right. But then even on the flip side, are there ones that you put out there that you're like, oh, that's not good, and people are like, hey, Kev, that was great? Have you ever?
Yeah, of course that happens.
So now in turn, this is all learning process as I grow in this industry, that I could be like, oh, I can learn from the stuff that I did prior and stuff that I do future. Correct.
Yeah, I think the thing that I would say to anybody, whether it's a person has more experience than me, or a person who's like you that's just starting out, is you don't want to kill yourself, beat yourself up too much, but you always want to look at things with a critical eye. What could I have done better? What did I do good? And the things that you did well in it, like when you're doing an interview, right? Which, hey, you have a very conversational style, and it's easy to talk to you. And so people are going to tell you things because you have that kind of personality, right? So you're doing really good, but you want to look at what are the things that I did good, follow up on those, and keep trying to improve those. But what are the things I did poorly? What could I have done better? And I think that's, anybody in any business, really how you want to handle it, but certainly in a public facing business like we have, because somebody's going to sit down at a period of time and they're going to read what I wrote. Just before I get the podcast with you, I retweeted 3 stories that I had written yesterday. Just, hey, I lost my job at Yahoo. So now I'm trying to figure out what's next. I want people to know I'm still working. So I had a website that I didn't really post on too much that I created when I was at Yahoo, just to write stuff like about things other than combat if I ever wanted to do it. And I hadn't posted in about 6 or 7 months. until I got laid off. And then I started saying, hey, I'm going to use this. So I've been writing just like I've been full-time employed and doing my thing. So yesterday I wrote 3 pieces, right? I put those out, I retweeted them, but now I'm sitting here and I know at some point somebody's going to sit down to read those, and they may have read them 2 minutes after I did it or 20 hours after I did it. You never know, and they're going to have a perspective on it, and I want to make sure that I can do the best I can to give them the best possible perspective. But we're humans and we're not always perfect, and we tend to make mistakes. So I strive to learn. I always try to be better. I want to be the best I can be. But you have to accept the fact that sometimes, you're not going to win a Pulitzer on this particular story.
Okay, so let me get to a couple things real quick. One, how do you handle, and it would be unethical if you didn't give your opinion on certain things.
I'm a columnist, so that's my job to give my opinion.
Oh, no, but I mean, if you weren't your true, this is how I really feel. If you were biased towards somebody, it would be people be like, hey, he always talks about him in this favorable light. But if it's what you believe, I believe that's okay. But how do you handle someone who is on the stage that, because you're covering big, high level people, fighters for the most part. Okay. And they see an article and they look at, and they see you and they're like, that guy wrote an article about me. I got a problem with that. But that's how you feel. Now, do you feel bad that you wrote it, or
No.
you just this is what it is?
No. So I would say this. Let me just say this to you, right?
Okay.
So I'm in a different position than a lot of people, right? I started out as a reporter, and so you're not supposed to put your opinion in those.
Okay.
You describe what you see, you report the facts, right?
Yep.
As a columnist. As a reporter, as a columnist, it is my job to analyze, give opinion. Not everybody's going to agree with it. You have a different opinion than I do. I want to write something thought-provoking and insightful, entertaining, hopefully sometimes, have those kind of things. But it doesn't always mean. Now, I think most fighters, you have, and I'll tell you some stories of experiences I've had with fighters on different things. I think for the most part, I would say in my 40 years, really good. Like I would say A-, in terms of relationships with fighters.
Mhm.
Nobody gives you a hard time too much. There've been some people that have been angry at you, but here's what I always try to do is, like, if I'm going to criticize you, hey, George, I think you did X wrong. I'm writing a column and I'm going to criticize you about it. So A, I tell you, and then B, I give you a chance to respond and defend whatever it is that I'm saying you did wrong, right? And I'm going to write my column based on that. So I am giving you the ability to respond. So I'm trying to be as fair as I can possibly be when I do it. And I never, some people think this, but it's never, ever, 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 ever personal, either in a good way or a bad way, right? So, I don't have personal feelings like that, right? And so that's one thing I know I'm good at, right? Not making it personal. And like I'll say this is a recent thing that happened, and I still don't understand why this happened. But Deontay Wilder doesn't talk to me, and at one point I had a great relationship with Deontay Wilder, and he stopped talking to me after the second fight with Tyson Fury when the fight got stopped in the 7th round. And 2 things happened. That, he didn't want the fight to be stopped, and I wrote it was a good decision to stop it. And then the aftermath on Monday, he spoke to 4 or 5 reporters individually, and I was one of the 4 or 5. I was the first one that he spoke to, and I asked a question. I said, Deontay, that did not seem like you in the ring. What happened? And he blamed the costume. I don't know if you remember that controversy.
Yep, I do. Mm-hmm.
He said the costume was too heavy. And I was like, what? I'm saying to myself, like, what? And I'm listening to his answer, and I'm like going, is he kidding with me? But he was talking seriously. And fortunately for me, I'm recording the interview and I'm listening to him. And so I kind of asked a follow-up question, and he said the same thing. So, okay, I was really careful when I wrote the story. I listened to the tape and I quoted him exactly correct. Then Lance Pugmire, who was at the LA Times at that point, he talked to him after me. Dan Raphael, who was at ESPN at that time, talked to him after Lance. Keith Idek, who was at Boxing Scene, talked to him. And I think we were the 4 that talked to him. All four of us spoke to him separately. Tim Smith of the PBC was on the phone. He was the one that connected us. Tim Smith heard the conversations with each of us and
Okay.
said we quoted him correctly. But somehow Fanta Wilder said, I made it up and I quoted things incorrectly. And I was getting all of a sudden this barrage of Twitter criticism, like really intense for a long period of time. And I had the audio. And so I released the first 45 seconds or so of the interview, which that was the only time I've ever done it. And it had my question to Deontay, which I described to you, and it had his full answer.
Okay.
And I put that out. So most people said, oh, okay, he did say it, and they left. But there were a few people that still, okay, what are you hiding in the rest of the interview? Well, I don't owe them that. I built up credibility over 40 years of doing this, and I didn't need to, I knew it was accurate. Tim Smith, who worked for Deontay with the PBC, knew it was accurate. The people who are, so I did not, when I wrote that, I said to myself, okay, just write this straight. I could have made fun of him, right? I could have said, oh, what a goofy thing, blah, blah.
Right.
But I just wrote it as a straight news story. This is what Deontay Wilder said. So now he hasn't talked to me since. Now, I don't know, was it the costume and all the people telling him that I wrote something I didn't, or was he mad because I said Mark Breland saved his life when the fight was stopped? One of those two reasons, he doesn't talk to me. But if you read my content on Wilder after that, I've written about him because he appears at press conferences, and I'm at the press conferences, and I can get the quotes and I can hear what he says and everything. If I did not tell you that I had an incident with him, nobody would know it, right? Nobody would know that he's not talking to me because I say, hey, I'm going to do my thing professionally. And, Deontay is one of the best fighters in the world. I think he's one of the hardest punchers of all time. I say those things. I don't, I'm not going after him now. So that's, like every now and then that happens, and it's sad when it does. And I would really like to, because Deontay was one of the guys I always loved because he was great to talk to. And if you go on my YouTube channel or you go through my Yahoo archives, you'll see prior to that fight, all these really good stories that I, had written about him and interviews I had done with him that were, positive, what he would have perceived as a positive light. And I wish I didn't have I don't have any negative feelings toward him, but he had negative feelings toward me because of that. And I wish that didn't exist, but it did not affect the way I cover him. Right.
Right. Do you think to that fight real quick, do you think Tyson just had his number? Or was it just he was off? There was something.
Yeah, I think styles make fights, right? And Tyson is Deontay's style. He is an offensive fighter. He's never been the traditional Floyd Mayweather or the traditional defensive fighter that you would think. And he throws punches from wild angles. And so if you have somebody that has straight punches and has some zip behind him, you're going to be able to hit him, right? And so he faced, when he fought Fury, a guy that was 40 or 50 pounds bigger than him, who was a really good boxer, who had a good chin himself. Fury had to have a good chin to, You can't beat Deontay Wilder no matter how good a boxer you are if you have a bad chin. And
Correct.
So it was like the combination of all the things that I think, that made Fury and Wilder such a great rivalry, right? Like, I think of it like Ali Frazier, right? They brought the best out in each other. And that's been a great rivalry. I think Wilder clearly is the second best heavyweight in the world. Now it's going to be interesting. We'll see what he does. He's fighting Joe Parker. And then if he gets past that, looks like he's going to fight AJ in March. I think he dominates AJ, to be honest with you. But I'll be curious if he ever fights Usyk, right? Usyk is a tremendous boxer. Usyk was 6'3", 220, which is plenty big, but not.
I don't know if he's going to be able to take Deontay Wilder is one of these guys, I think, that if he catches you, I give all the credit to Tyson Fury for getting up, but I think you're correct. I think he blows through. I think he's going to beat Joe Parker pretty easily.
I do too. I agree with that. And I think he beats AJ pretty easily.
I think he beats him pretty easily. I don't know what happened to AJ. He kind of fell off. he fell off the face of the earth there. He just really hasn't been the same since he lost to Andy Ruiz. He just hasn't been even like a shell of himself. You know,
Well,
you
I
could
think I look back, like there were signs that that was coming, right? I mean, he was never the most polished boxer. His opposition level, was, didn't have that A+ opposite. He fought Vladimir Klitschko, and Klitschko's last fight, after Klitschko lost to Fury, and look at how badly beaten up AJ got in that fight against an aged
Mhm.
Vladimir Klitschko. AJ was hittable. And AJ didn't have, I think AJ was a great athlete who accomplished a lot because of his athleticism, but he was never a great boxer. There's some guys that are great boxers that aren't good athletes, and there's some guys that are both. AJ was one that was a really good athlete who was successful in boxing, even though he was never the greatest pure boxer. And I think AJ, has had a wonderful career. Like, when we break him down, we're breaking him down, and any criticism we give of him is knowing that he's fighting at the highest level now, right?
Right. Who one opinion on, if I could real quickly, Andy Ruiz, why is he not getting the opportunity to fight?
Well, I think it's money from what I understand. He is asking for crazy amounts of money. And, there's one of the problems that boxing has, right? So I have always been, I'm in favor of the athletes, whether it's baseball, football, basketball, whatever sport it is, let them make as much money as possible, right? I'm disappointed in golf. I'm a golf fan, right? I'm disappointed to see John Rahm go to the Live Golf Tour because I want to see all the best players play each other, and to me, having John Rahm and, all the other stars of the PGA Tour coming down the stretch in the Masters or the US Open, that's great theater, but I'm happy for him. You get, it's reported he made 600 million. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but
600 million?
yeah, that's what they gave him. The Saudis gave him 600 million is what the report is.
Good Lord.
That is life altering money, right? So that's generation altering money. And so
Mhm.
how do you say no to it? But I think one of the problems that happens in boxing is that the fighters at the very top are way overpaid for what they do, right?
Yeah.
And I've written this a million times, and I mentioned it yesterday. I never have a problem with what they paid Floyd Mayweather because Floyd Mayweather generated more than what he charged, right? He put butts in the seats. He sold pay-per-views, and there was a whole industry around Floyd Mayweather. But you have a lot of guys. I mean, look at the money the Charlo brothers make, right? They're not selling tickets. They're not selling pay-per-views. They're not attractions. They're just good, solid fighters, not great fighters, good, solid fighters. And they're getting this multiple millions of dollars. It's hard to put a fight on and put a good fight card on when you have to pay somebody like that, especially somebody like that who is not able to, fill the arena. Like they can give tickets away, and, a trick, I don't know if a lot of people know, but if the promoter pays tax on the ticket, then the ticket is counted as paid, even if they
Correct.
didn't sell it.
Yeah,
So a
yeah.
lot of times what happens is, if you go on a lot of these fights and you look on Thursday, saying, what's the ticket manifest? I want to buy tickets and go to the fight. You can see a lot of tickets available, right? And not
Mhm.
all, there's still more tickets available than that, but because brokers have taken some and the brokers are actively trying to sell them, but they're shown right as sold seats. But then on Saturday, all of a sudden, there's no seats available. Well, that's because they started giving them out to, for free, and they paid the tax on them, right? And that's what happens. And so that's why sometimes, people think, oh, so and so is selling tickets. No, 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 no. And so I guess my issue is I want to see in boxing the floor come up, the lower people and the middle class people make more, and the top come down, because then we can have really competitive fights made consistently, right? That's what needs to happen. But you have this huge gap in boxing. Anybody that knows the business of boxing will tell you that 99% of the fighters make, or I mean, excuse me, 1% of the fighters make 99% of the money.
Right.
And so that is a big problem when you want, like, boxing is such a great sport, George. It is a phenomenal sport when it's done right. And when you have the best fights and the evenly matched, they can make those kind of fights, but the pay scale is way out of whack. So if you pay the middle class fighters more, they're going to be more willing to take risks. and then you pay these guys less so that they're hungrier to get in and fight. If you
Mhm.
make $5 million for a fight, you don't have to fight again for 2 years, right? You're pretty good.
Yeah.
And there's no incentive to be active often. But if you're making, hey, the value of $1 million is now, people don't realize how much money that is, and they scoff at it. I don't want $1 million bucks, and come on. So
Well,
that
inflation is high, Kevin. I got to tell you, inflation is sky high over this side here. I'm in the retail business, so I get it. I get where your point is. But something that you said earlier, how the entry level of boxing is there. It's basically you could be a professional walking right off the street. That is an issue. And I say that only because I see so many times these managers and these other people are screaming for X amount of dollars. And let's not forget the business, if you're not generating money, you're out of business. You just are. So at what point do they take a little from the top, take a little from the bottom, and even the promoters too. They got to kind of, I don't know how much these guys are making, but there's got to be give and take here. There has to be, or else this is not going to be. I mean, obviously, streaming is going to take over and what have you. It's going to be very minimal. I like pro
streaming is
boxing.
fantastic. Look at what's happening in the industry, right? Just what happened this year alone. Just think of the last 6 months. Disney Plus raised prices. Netflix raised price. Every single one of them. Amazon raised the price. So
Mhm.
every single streaming raised the price way up, right? DAZN used to be $99 a year, and you got all the fights. Now it's
Yeah.
$250 a year, and you still have to pay per view, right?
Right.
So streaming is not necessarily the answer either. I think the whole business is kind of in a mess because of the pay scale. And now, it almost has to be reimagined. And because of how vast the business is, and there's no connection, right? There's no one central authority, whereas it, like, take UFC, like, to compare it.
I was just going to
you
ask
know,
you about that.
the UFC is one league, and it's perceived to be the major league of MMA, right?
Mhm.
With the best fighters and everything. So they have a central authority ruling it, and so they can handle and create it and redo it. If boxing could do that, boxing would be hugely popular too, and it would immediately zoom way up the sports list, because if you start putting on the fights that can be put on, and give the fighters incentive to fight hard and to try to put sensational fights out there, it would be the same way, right? Boxing would have the same, but because the fighter, the way the business is set up,
Mhm.
it's very difficult.
And it's something I talked to Teddy Atlas about a month ago, and I even suggested Teddy be sort of like a commissioner of just because Dana White, and I'm gonna do your transition to MMA. Dana White is a good friend of yours. And he is probably number one, not only the best promoter I've ever, and that includes Vince McMahon and Don King, the best promoter, marketer, a businessman I've ever been able to study. I did it from afar. I don't know him. Because he's taken things and he's controlled it in a way where it says, not that he forces them, and people get on him about the pay scale and whatever, but it's still a business at the end of the day. He's not a billionaire for no reason. So, how do you transfer that into a UFC model slash, you're because you are a 1099 employee essentially. That's a touchy subject anyway. But how do you transfer that into a boxing realm?
Well, that's the problem, because boxing has there's no, but who would we say right now is major league and in boxing, like the major, all the promoters are, sometimes a promoter you never heard of comes up with a fighter. It was his next door neighbor, and he kind of, nurtured the kid along, and all of a sudden he has this kid that becomes a star, and now he becomes a factor in boxing while this kid's fighting, and then that kid goes and he's gone, right? And
right.
so in UFC, it became pretty clear years ago that they were the number one promoter. And so they were able to set the terms. And while, yes, the fighters don't make as much money at the top, the fighters at the bottom make way more. And so if you can have a middle class of fighters, which is always going to be the biggest group of fighters, that are out there, whether it's boxing, MMA, or whatever combat sport you want to pick, and you can pay them well, where they can make a living, where they're, let's say on the low side, 250,000 a year, not a fight. And on the high side, $1.5 million a year. I would say a shitload of UFC fighters most of them fall into that category where they're
Right.
making a quarter of a million a year to, $1.5 million a year. That's a pretty good salary for most people, right? And you can live a comfortable life on all those salaries and you have it. And if you're in that group, you do good. Now, then there's incentive, and you want to fight because you can get up. Conor McGregor's the top of the pay scale there, but let's drop him off because he's kind of like a unicorn. But then you can still look at what John Jones made and Habib. So like say 10 million being the cap. Let's just use that number. I don't know if that's accurate, but let's just use that as an artificial cap for the absolute elite of the elite who are selling the pay-per-views and selling the tickets and doing all that. You can build a business around that. And that the problem that exists in boxing is that, you have to pay the top guys so much that you can't, and then they're particular, like, look, I wrote yesterday about this, you're going to see, people are going to say, we want to see Devin Haney fight Tank, right? And I wrote in my column, I said, you're going to hear people from the Davis side say Haney is too big, meaning he's too big, weight-wise, because he weighed 165 after he rehydrated, or he's not big enough because meaning he doesn't sell tickets, right? And they're just going to make excuses to not get the fight made until way down the line. Wouldn't it be better if we said, hey, in 2024, they're going to fight each other. We know they're going to fight each other. And they might fight 2 or 3 other times after that, right? What's the problem with that? Frazier, Ali and Frazier did it. Sugar Ray Robinson fought Jake LaMotta, twice in 3 weeks once. And, he fought,
Right.
I think boxing, like those are the fights that the fans want to see. Put those guys together, but there's no incentive, for them to do that. And that becomes the problem in my mind in the business.
So, real briefly now that we're gonna get to a wrap, please. And again, I appreciate your time. It means a lot to me from a small guy like me to interview a guy like you. A couple things. Number one, what is your take on a world heavyweight title fight against a UFC live event? Both at the same.
What do you mean going again?
How do you comparing? Like if you're there as a reporter,
Okay.
let's say the atmosphere, UFC high level. Let's say John Jones versus let's just say Francis Ngannou again, and then you have Tyson Fury versus Deontay Wilder when he was at or someone else. I don't even know who could possibly, or put Haney Tank up there. What is the difference in atmosphere?
Well, I don't think there's any if it's like the right fight, but so here, I said this to somebody recently. I get asked all the time, what do you like better, boxing or MMA? And it used to be, I would say always boxing because I grew up as a boxing person. But, over the last 20 years, I've grown to love MMA. So now it's a more nuanced answer. So I have to then say at that point, well, it depends on the card and not just the main fight, but the whole card. And generally that tends to be better on the UFC side, right? But if I have 2 really, really good fights, I'll tend to and I know, like if I had this omniscient power to say both of these fights are going to be all-time great fights, right? I like the boxing one better because it's 12 rounds, right? It's longer. You get to see it for more, right? In MMA, you get a 3-round fight or a 5-round fight, and they're crazy, right? There's so many great fights, but they're 3 or 5 rounds. If I get that, Corrales Castillo for 12 rounds or Hagler Hearns for 12 rounds, I mean, oh my God! So how can you? So that would be, but how I really do it, George, is I just look at it and I say, okay, number one, how do the main events compare? What do I think of the how is the match going to be? And I try to use my experience to guess, okay, is this going to be great? So then then I favor this one over that one because of that. Then what's the rest of the undercard like? Am I going to be entertained by the undercard, or am I going to be sitting there, falling asleep until the main event comes on, right? That's kind of how I'll break them down.
And my final couple questions here. Number one, what was the greatest fight you ever covered?
Greatest in-person fight I ever covered would be Corrales Castillo. I remember, that fight was in Las Vegas. I was still working for the Las Vegas Review-Journal. I wrote a lot about Diego Corrales because he lived in Las Vegas, and I got to know him, really, really well. And of course, I remember sitting with him one day. We were he was actually on. I had a radio show at the time in Las Vegas, and he was on my show. And then we went out and got a coffee afterwards, and we were just shooting the shit. And I was talking about the Castillo fight, which was expected to be made, but at that point had not been finalized. And he said to me, "I would walk through the fires of hell to win that fight." And then the fight comes and you see what happened, right?
Oh,
And it was just this incredible fight. And the 10th round was the most dramatic round ever. And to me, I think that was probably the greatest fight I ever saw. But I've seen so many of them, right? And
mhm.
one of the underrated ones, Bo Holyfield won, which was a phenomenal fight. Pryor Arguello, just an incredible fight. I was not at Hagler Hearn, so I couldn't say that one, but I did watch it, but I was not there. But yeah, I mean, incredible fights over the years. But the one in person had to be Corrales Castillo, just because of the drama, the sustained action, everything.
The Hearns and Hagler gets that title a lot, but I didn't think it went long enough. I did 3 rounds. You know what I mean? It was good for the 3 rounds it lasted, but But I agree with you. Corrales.
But would you put this in there? Because I like what you said. And I've written that a couple times when I'm picking the all-time. The fight that I often say that people don't, immediately is the Thrilla in Manila, Ali Frazier 3, October 1st, 1975.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that fight, if you watch that, 14 rounds of unbelievable brutality in 100+ degree heat.
That's tough to do. That was, I think if you look at all the circumstances together, 14 rounds, that kind of heat, that kind of pressure put on both people fighting that they landed so many hard punches in that fight. That was actually probably life altering for both.
Certainly for Ali. Certainly for Ali.
Yeah, definitely for Ali. Okay, so hardest puncher. Now you've been at ringside to see a lot of these punchers. Hardest puncher.
Well, I don't think there's any question Deontay Wilder. I mean, Mike Tyson would, most people would say Mike Tyson. I think Wilder had more leverage, right? And I just look at he does with these guys, right? So I think Wilder number one and Mike Tyson number two.
And then finally, up close in person, who was the greatest fighter of your era that you saw?
Mayweather. And
you could break it up. Okay, I was going to say that because most people don't say Mayweather. I say Mayweather. He was the greatest I ever saw.
So I would say this, right? I have Sugar Ray Leonard voted ahead of him in terms of all-time on the all-time list. But I think, when I think of, I was just getting started when Ray was kind of in his prime, right? In the 80s.
Yes.
And I was, but Floyd, I covered Floyd in the amateurs. I covered, Floyd in the pros. I was ringside for 43 of Floyd's 50 fights. And so when I say that, then I have to say, Mayweather, was the guy. Do I think he would have beaten Sugar Ray Leonard if they had fought at welterweight? No. I think Leonard would have beaten Floyd. But I think when I think of my era of fighters, I have to say him. The greatest fighter of all time, in my opinion, is not even a contest, is Ray Robinson. But, not even a contest. But, Mayweather, I think of my era, what I would consider my era, would be the best.
Do you think he gets enough of that? Because he does get a lot, because people tend to say others. Canelo, they say Canelo first for some reason. A lot of people that I speak to, I mean, the younger kids say
really?
I don't think so. Yeah, they do. Now,
Canelo's a terrific fighter, but best of all time.
I see. I think it's biased. I think it's biased because most of the people that I speak with are of my ethnic background. They do like the Hispanic Mexican fighters.
They're not picking Chavez. They're picking Canelo over Chavez.
Oh, I think because of his look.
I would just say those are people who are fans who are misinformed, right? I mean,
right.
Canelo is a terrific fighter, and he's one of the best fighters in the world right now. And I give Canelo tremendous credit. He has huge cojones, and he fights anybody. And this nonsense that he's ducking David Benavidez, bullshit. He is not ducking David Benavidez, right?
No.
And get away with it, and I think it's a tough fight for Canelo, right? But Canelo's not ducking him. I think Canelo would rather fight Bivol, in my opinion, because he lost him and he wants to try to avenge the loss, but he's not ducking David Benavidez. But anybody who says Canelo is the greatest fighter of all time or of his era is, if we consider Mayweather in his era since they fought, no.
I don't think Mayweather has gotten as much credit from the mainstream either.
I would disagree with you on that, George, because look, he started the thing, the greatest of all time. And I hear a lot of people say Mayweather's the greatest fighter of all time. No, I mean, do you think he would have beaten Tommy Hearns? Like, Tommy Hearns was a flawed fighter, but styles make fights. And imagine Tommy Hearns with his height and reach, range, power that he had. Imagine what would Mayweather have done against him, right? I think Floyd is one of the all-time greats. I just told you he's the greatest fighter of my generation. But I also think that, I hear a lot of people vastly overrate him as if it was impossible for him to ever be beaten. And I don't think that was the case.
Yeah, and I think he do you think he kind of went away from some people like Margarito? And at the time, Margarito was the one that they thought he would beat him.
So here's what I would say. Like, now look at what Manny Pacquiao did to Margarito, right? So do we really look in retrospect and say that Mayweather wouldn't have done something like that to him? Like, I think Mayweather was so much faster than Margarito. Margarito would have not made it through 6 or 7 rounds, right? Because Mayweather would have known he's not going to be able to get hit, and he would have been pummeling Margarito, right? Pummeling him. The issue I have with Mayweather and Margarito was, like, that's what's happened. Is boxing a sport or a business? Like, what is it? And that became solely business in the second half of Floyd's career, right? And it wasn't a sport, and you weren't getting the fight because it was an entertaining fight that the people wanted to see. You were getting the fight that they thought made the most money at the least risk at that second half of his career, when he became such a big. Now, Floyd fought everybody. I'm not saying that, right? But the point I'm making is that, like, the Margarito fight was kind of a one. That should have been a fight Floyd jumped at, because he would have destroyed Margarito. Not even a ballpark of a fight. Floyd would have never been hit. Like Pacquiao was hit, but Pacquiao was more of an offensive fighter than Floyd, right? But Pacquiao destroyed him. There's no way that Floyd would have had any issues with him, and that's a fight that should have happened.
Well, good. I'm glad you set me straight on that. That was good. I like that. I like that you come right at me with that. Good. Kevin, again, I appreciate it. Can you give it all your social and where that people can contact you and get a hold of you?
Yeah, so I am on X, I guess, if that's what it is. X, at Kevin I, Kevini, and my Instagram is Kevin Iole. So just my name, all one word, Instagram and Facebook. So you can reach me on there. Unfortunately, I'm not on TikTok, even though I see the slap fighting gets a lot of TikTok viewers. I got a little too much gray hair, I think, for TikTok, so I'm going to pass on that one.
Well, good. But Kevin, I could speak to you all day. This is great. I love speaking to someone as knowledgeable as you. And again, I thank you for the opportunity to talk to someone like this. And I maybe someday I'm the next Ariel Helwani, and you could push me. You could push me to that thing. Hey, listen, I'm just a regular bagel guy. I just make bagels all day. That's what I do. But
I love bagels, so if you make good ones, I'm going to be a fan.
Listen, I go out to Vegas once a year, every year, to see my stepson, and we're there in July. But when you come to the East Coast, do you ever come here, or do you go back home to Pittsburgh?
I was in New York for UFC just recently.
Do you go by Pittsburgh at all, or no?
I have not been in Pittsburgh. When's the last time I was at my brother's funeral, which was 2007.
Oh, so okay.
Haven't been to Pittsburgh in a long time.
Pittsburgh, Eaton Park, I'm sure that's a big thing.
Of course.
Yeah, I'm friends with the CEO of Eaton Park. He's a good friend of mine. And that's why when someone says Pittsburgh, and I heard you're from Pittsburgh, oh, he's got to know Eaton Park.
Do I have a Pittsburgh accent, by the way?
No, you actually have more of a New York, Jersey type accent.
Okay, I'm born and raised in Pittsburgh. But if you look at all my Pittsburgh stuff up there.
Look at that. My kids would love it. They'd absolutely love it. They'd absolutely love it. They're big Steeler fans. And
me too.
What's that?
Me too.
Do you know?
Up here on these walls, I have Ollie Foreman, Leonard Duran, Ollie Liston. This is me and Sugar Ray Leonard.
Oh, yeah.
So I have that. Ollie Frazier, me and Mayweather, Secretariat. So I have all my favorites there.
Man, and it's all in Vegas. You're in Vegas now. You're a Vegas guy.
I've been in Vegas for over 30 years. So yeah, it's
Yeah,
been a
you're a
while.
Vegas guy now. You're a Vegas guy now. But hey, when I retire, I am moving out to Vegas, by the way.
All right. Well, look forward to seeing you out here at some point.
Kevin, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Anytime, brother. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching the Zapata Brand Podcast. Please subscribe to the podcast and listen where all podcasts are available. Coming up next on the Zapata Brand Podcast, he's an award-winning columnist that covers all combat sports. He has covered every major fight in boxing and UFC. Now, you get to hear his story. The Zapata Brand Podcast welcomes Kevin Iole.